Picture this. It's a Saturday morning in 1986. A kid, maybe 9, maybe 11, is sitting on the living room carpet, alone, watching cartoons, cereal straight from the box because nobody's awake yet. Mom and dad are either still asleep, already at work, or somewhere. Nobody left a note. Nobody called to check in. And honestly, that kid isn't scared. That kid is fine. And if you are Gen X, or if you love someone who is, I want you to hold that image for a second, because what looks like neglect to modern eyes was, to an entire generation, just Tuesday. And the psychology that formed inside those quiet Saturday mornings, those unsupervised afternoons, those figure-it-out-yourself childhoods, that psychology is fascinating, layered, resilient, and deeply misunderstood. So today, let's actually go there. Let's pull back the curtain on the psychology of Generation X, the generation born roughly between 1965 and 1980, and understand not just what they are, but why they are that way. Because there's a reason Gen X is simultaneously the most self-reliant and the most cynical generation. There's a reason they distrust institutions, avoid the spotlight, and somehow manage keep functioning when everything around them is falling apart. And it goes so much deeper than they listen to Nirvana and wore flannel. Let me take you back to the beginning. Grew up in a world that wasn't particularly interested in them. I say that without judgment. It's just the sociological truth. They were the children of the baby boomers, a generation so enormous and so culturally dominant that Gen X got perpetually squeezed to the margins. While the boomers were redefining culture, politics, and the economy, Gen X was quietly growing up in the background. They were the first generation to grow up with the widespread rise of divorce. The divorce rate in the United States nearly doubled between 1960 and 1980. Latchkey kids became a cultural phenomenon. After-school care wasn't a given. It was, go home, let yourself in, don't burn the house down, we'll be back by 6. Here's where the psychology gets interesting. Psychologists call the experience of navigating the world without consistent adult scaffolding a form of autonomous attachment development. In plain English, when kids are left to their own devices, they develop self-sufficiency early. They learn to regulate their own emotions, solve their own problems, and crucially, they stop expecting the world to rescue them. That last part is enormous. Think about it. Gen X didn't grow up with helicopter parents hovering. Nobody was calling the school to complain about a bad grade on their behalf. Nobody was advocating for them at every turn. They learned, early and viscerally, that the cavalry is probably not coming. And you know what? That belief became a superpower and a wound, often at the same time. Because here's the paradox at the heart of Gen X psychology. Their self-reliance is both their greatest strength and the thing that makes emotional intimacy genuinely hard. Research in attachment theory, particularly the work of psychologists like Mary Ainsworth and later Philip Shaver, shows us that early experiences of emotional unavailability, even unintentional unavailability, can wire the brain toward called avoidant attachment. That need you learn not to need. You learn to dismiss dependency as weakness. You build walls not out of coldness, but out of a very rational, very disappointment. If you're Gen X and you've ever caught yourself saying, "I'm fine," when you're clearly not, this is where that comes from. It's not stubbornness. It's your nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do. It learned that needing help didn't reliably produce help, so it stopped asking. Now layer on top of that the cultural context. Gen X came of age during a remarkable collision of disillusionment. They watched Gate unfold, or their parents did, right in front of them. They saw the AIDS crisis devastate their communities. They watched the economy crater in the '80s. And then, just as they graduated into adulthood, full of energy, they were promptly told by the cultural conversation that nobody particularly cared because the millennials were arriving and they were fascinating. Gen X became, famously, the forgotten middle child of generations. And that matters psychologically because identity formation during adolescence, which psychologist Erik Erikson called the identity versus role confusion stage, requires mirroring. It requires the culture, the media, the adults around you to reflect back to you that you matter, that your experience is seen. Gen X got precious little of that. So what did they do? They made their own culture, in the shadows, deliberately underground. Punk, grunge, indie film, zines, skate culture. The DIY ethic wasn't just aesthetic, it was existential. If the mainstream world wasn't going to acknowledge them, they'd build something rawer, realer, and entirely on their own terms. Picture a teenager in 1991 dubbing cassette tapes in their bedroom, making mixtapes to trade with friends, discovering bands that nobody else knew about yet. That was a psychological act of agency, of saying, I define what has value, not them. That distrust of mainstream culture, that reflexive skepticism of anything that got too popular or too corporate, that's not just taste. That's a trauma-informed worldview dressed up as cool. And here's what I find genuinely moving about all of this. Gen X developed what researchers sometimes call post-traumatic growth on a generational scale. All of that early adversity, all of that benign neglect, all of that institutional disappointment, it built something. Studies on resilience, including landmark work by psychologist Emmy Werner, who tracked at-risk children over decades, consistently show that autonomy and problem-solving in childhood are among the strongest predictors of adult resilience. Gen X basically ran a 40-year field experiment in exactly that, and they came out the other side as the quiet backbone of every workplace, every crisis, every moment when someone needs to just handle it without drama. You've noticed this, right? When something genuinely goes wrong, a real emergency, a system failure, an actual crisis, it's often the Gen Xers in the room who get quieter and start solving. Not because they don't feel it, but because they feel it and do the thing anyway. That's not numbness, that's regulation. Hard-earned, scar tissue regulation. But I want to be honest with you, because this script would be incomplete without it. The same psychological armor that makes Gen X so capable can also make them lonely. The same independence that helped them survive can make vulnerability feel like a threat. And in a world that now, finally, talks openly about mental health, about attachment, about emotional needs, some Gen Xers are arriving at that conversation later than they might have, finding words for things they always felt, but never named. And that takes a different kind of courage. Not the Saturday morning alone with cereal kind, the sit down and actually feel it kind. If you're Gen X, here's what I want you to hear. Your skepticism is wisdom, not cynicism. Your self-reliance is strength, not coldness. And the quiet way you've shown up, for decades, without applause, without the generational narrative the boomers got, or the cultural conversation the millennials seem to permanently occupy, that showing up mattered. It built things. It held things together. It modeled to every younger person watching that you can be competent and real and a little bit sardonic and still deeply, genuinely human. And if you're not Gen X, if you're trying to understand someone who is, try to see the latchkey kid underneath the composed adult. Try to understand that I'm fine sometimes means I learned a very long time ago that saying otherwise didn't change much. And the best thing you can do is just stay, consistently, reliably. Because for a generation that grew up doubting the cavalry, consistency is the most radical act of love. Generation X didn't get the spotlight. They didn't get the anthems, or the iconic generational narrative, or the think pieces written about them every other Tuesday. But they got something maybe more valuable. They got forged. And the psychology that came out of those Saturday mornings on the carpet, eating cereal alone, figuring it out, that psychology is tougher, weirder, and more interesting than most people give it credit for. So tell me, does this resonate with you? Are you Gen X? Or do you see this in someone you love? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more psychology content like this, the deep, honest, human kind, subscribe, because we're just getting started.